The first powered flight, with the exclusion of hot air balloons, was made by the Wright brothers on December 7th, 1903. Their Wright Flyer was composed of spruce wood for its strength and lightweight properties, and the wings were covered in fabric. It utilized a 12 horsepower four-cylinder engine, and the entire plane weighed 605 pounds. The first flight was made into 20-mile-per-hour headwinds in order to increase the lift generated by the wings. The flight only lasted 12 seconds, and they traveled a total distance of 120 feet, which is shorter than the wingspan of a Boeing 747. In later test flights, their Wright Flyer was able to achieve a maximum speed of 30 miles per hour. The footage shown here is actually from a later flight test, as there is no original camera footage from the first flight. Just 11 years after the Wright brothers' first flight, World War I kicked off in 1914. War often drives innovation and technology, and all countries were trying to utilize the airplane in a military application. Initially, planes were used for reconnaissance, but they were quickly weaponized in order to combat enemy air units. These World War I fighters were mainly of wood structure, with the exception of some later war Fokker airframes. Most of the fighters were biplanes, and innovations like machine gun synchronization allowed machine guns to be mounted in the nose of the plane and fired between the spinning propellers, allowing pilots to get on target easily. The Fokker DR-1 utilized a 9-cylinder rotary piston engine, producing 110 horsepower and allowing the plane to achieve 99 miles per hour in level flight. The British Sopwith Camel also used a 9-cylinder rotary piston engine capable of 130 horsepower and 113 miles per hour in level flight. Quite the improvement in technology in just a couple years since the Wright brothers' first flight. As aircraft technology improved, daring pilots such as Charles Lindbergh were looking for ways to push the limit. In 1927, 24 years after the first flight, Lindbergh made the first transatlantic flight. His plane of choice, the Spirit of St. Louis, was produced by Ryan Airlines. It incorporated a metal tube fuselage and treated fabric covering. Its radial engine produced 233 horsepower, and it was outfitted with 5 fuel tanks in order to make the long-distance flight. In order to improve the center of gravity and the balance of the plane, the main tank had to be placed in the front of the fuselage, meaning there could be no front windshield and visibility was limited to the side windows. The flight from Long Island, New York to Paris, France took 33 hours and 30 minutes. Just 36 years after the first flight, the first functional jet-powered aircraft took its maiden flight on August 27, 1939. The German Heinkel 178 used a single turbojet engine, producing 992 pounds of thrust that propelled the aircraft to an impressive 372 miles per hour. All of this happened the very same week that Germany invaded Poland. As evidenced in World War I, war again proved to take aviation to a whole new level with the purpose of destroying an enemy. The first operational jet fighter, the Me-262, was put into service in 1944. It was powered by 2 Junkers Umo 004 turbojet engines, producing 1,980 pounds of thrust each. These turbojets accelerated the 8,400-pound Me-262 to a top speed of 560 miles per hour in level flight. By comparison, one of the fastest Allied planes, the P-51D, was capable of 440 miles per hour. While the 262 displayed a significant advantage, by 1944, Germany lacked the skilled pilots and industrial capability to change the tide of the war. Captured 262s were studied by both the United States and the Soviet Union, and helped influence the design of America's F-86 and the Soviets' MiG-15 jet fighters. Perhaps Germany's most famous wonder weapon, the V-2 rocket, also rose to prevalence in 1944. The leader of the V-2 program, Wernher von Braun, began his research and testing of rockets in the 1930s. The first successful V-2 test launch occurred in October of 1942, but combat operations couldn't proceed until September of 1944. In the following months, before the end of World War II, approximately 3,172 V-2 rockets were launched, mainly targeting London and Antwerp, resulting in the deaths of roughly 9,000 people, while roughly 12,000 slave laborers died in the labor camps producing the rockets. The V-2s were capable of traveling at speeds up to 3,580 miles per hour, and a V-2 rocket was the first man-made object to enter space. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union rushed to capture top German engineers to aid in their own rocket development. Von Braun and over 700 additional top Nazi engineers were brought to America in Operation Paperclip. These Germans played a crucial role in the Apollo missions. 44 years after the first flight, Chuck Yeager piloted the Bell X-1 during the first manned supersonic flight. He achieved 700 miles per hour, Mach 1.06, at an altitude of 45,000 feet. It is important to note that the speed of sound changes with altitude and temperature. While the speed of sound at sea level is approximately 760 miles per hour, it gets lower as altitude increases. The Bell X-1's rocket engine produced 6,000 pounds of thrust, and later more powerful variants were capable of 1,600 miles per hour. In 1957, the Soviet Union made history by launching the first satellite, Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was launched on a modified R-7 rocket, which was initially designed as an intercontinental ballistic missile. The team developing the R-7 was largely comprised of captured German engineers who previously worked on the V-2 program. The rocket weighed in at 272 tons, producing 880,000 pounds of thrust at liftoff. The satellite itself was about the size of a beach ball. Weighing in at 184 pounds, it was much larger than anything the United States was working on at the time, and therefore it helped spark the space race, with America investing heavily to catch up. Once Sputnik 1 was in orbit, it only took about 96 minutes to make a revolution around the Earth. It traveled at an average speed of 18,000 miles per hour, and after orbiting for 3 months, it had traveled a total of 43 million miles. Just 4 years later, the Soviet Union took a commanding lead in the space race. Vostok 1 launched on April 12, 1961, carrying Yuri Gagarin. Gagarin successfully made it into space, completed one orbit around Earth, and returned safely. Finally, in July of 1969, the Apollo 11 mission was executed. The Saturn V rocket launched on July 16th. After 4 days of travel through space, the lunar module Eagle landed in the Sea of Tranquility on the Moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin took their first steps on the Moon in the early hours of July 21st. They successfully returned to Earth on July 24th after spending a total of 8 days in space. The Saturn V rocket that got them to the Moon was developed under the direction of Wernher von Braun. To this day, it is the heaviest, tallest, and most powerful operational rocket in history. It weighed in at nearly 6.5 million pounds, and it was 363 feet tall. Saturn V was a 3-stage rocket, with Stage 1 producing an incredible 7.5 million pounds of thrust. All of this occurred just 66 years after the Wright brothers' first flight. In fact, many people were alive for both monumental events. Interestingly, a small piece of wooden fabric from the original Wright Flyer was taken to the Moon by the crew of Apollo 11. This exponential nature of technology and advancement stands as an example of what we are capable of in the future when truly motivated.